My background is I'm actually a Professor of General Practice and Public Health from the University of Sydney, Australia, and I think I'm your newest visiting professor, having been appointed in January as a visiting professor here at Imperial, working with Majid. For the last 6 years I've been working in the UK in varying activities. I reinvent myself a little bit, but part of them has been working in Biomed Central as Medical Director and continuing a research profile, and Ricky can probably tell you about that at another stage. Today I want to talk to you about the work I've been doing for the last 2 years, and this is an area that I think of growing concern for primary care now that the consortia are going to take over some of the commissioning of pharmaceuticals. So I want to talk to you about a little bit about how pricing, reimbursement and market access works in the European Union. Do many of you have experience in this area? Because there's a lot of terminology and I just want to jump into the terminology. No? So if I catch you out, or you put your hand up and I'll stop, and I've got an Australian accent, which is difficult, but apparently very, very interesting. But 2, it gives me the opportunity to speak very quickly. So if I'm speaking too quickly, please let me know and I'll slow down a bit as well. So PRMA stands for Pricing, Reimbursement and Market Access. And they are the 3 key features of getting any new technology into a healthcare market, whether it be a pharmaceutical drug, whether it be an investigational technique, whatever it is. Pricing, reimbursement and market access are the 3 ways that these products enter the markets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about them. Okay, so I suppose the first thing to have a think about is what happens in a pharmaceutical company and how do products get to market. And I suppose I didn't tell you, I've done the American thing. I've been a medical director in the pharmaceutical industry as well, in and out of academia. So in my time as a medical director, I learned a lot about how companies work. And what happens is you've got a pharmaceutical company that has a research arm. Now sometimes they have the research arm within the company and sometimes it's without. And at the moment, with the collapse of banks, what is the safest industry for all the pension funds to put their money in? The pharmaceutical industry. So consequently, the pharmaceutical industry is in a renaissance in terms of pension funds. Because where do people invest their money for the future? In very blue chip industries, which is the pharmaceutical industry. How does the pharmaceutical industry maintain its status? Well, it has what's called a pipeline of new drugs. Just like new products run out, it has a pipeline of new drugs that come out. And a company is only as good as its pipeline. So the companies are based on what they've got coming out, and they have particular areas of interest. Now sometimes some companies don't have pipelines, and they buy companies. For example, Roche bought Genentech, and that's how the Herceptin, HER2 receptor came about, and how Herceptin came about, from Genentech. So Roche went out and bought the company, holus bolus, and that's how we have the breast cancer drug Herceptin. So a lot of companies have either within a pipeline or they get it without. Now this developmental pipeline from research to sales can take, how many years do you reckon? Guess. 5? 10? About 15 to 20, depending on the drug. It's an awfully long process. Because you start at the research end with something like each company has about 50,000 molecules, and they have to whittle down the 50,000 molecules with very little proof of concept to something that they're going to use. Now I can tell you about Amgen, and this is on public knowledge. It bought a product for melanoma 6 years ago that they'd been working in the Stanford labs on for 10 years before that. It's a bit like, do you know how Pasteur developed pasteurization? He had a cold and his nose dropped onto an agar plate. And then he worked out that lysosome was very good for pasteurization. Well, this researcher in a Stanford lab had a research student who had a cold. It just so happened when he looked at his genetic makeup, he had a particularly useful genetic aberration that produced a compound that works against melanoma from his cold. So Amgen bought the company for $3 billion based on the research results of 20 patients. This product is still 5 years, 3 to 5 years from market. So when we're looking at the investment costs of pharma industry, they're enormous. And 1 in every 5 products falls over. And we'll talk about why they fall over. So the industry has a long time frame, has a high risk activity, and has to have a pipeline running. So it starts with research, and then the medical area helps set up the clinical trials. And the clinical trials, essentially in the first instance, if you've got a molecule, first you have to see, does the molecule work? So that's called proof of concept. Does it do anything? We think it does, but we don't know. And sometimes that's done on animal models first. And usually they've got a whole breed of well-developed mice that are particularly got genetic makeup to test these things. They're called knockout mice because they knock out bits of it. So the medical then tests it, and the first set of tests is, as I said, proof of concept. Does this drug do anything? And that's called phase 1. And phase 2 is it safe? And if you remember what happened at Northwick Park with those 6 men who had the major neurological problems, that was because they were doing a phase 2 test to see if it was safe. And guess what they learned? It wasn't safe. Fabulous. Now let's tell you about safety. Safety is a pretty tricky thing, because one very unsafe drug that was off the market for many years is one of the best drugs we have now for treating some hematological malignancies. Do you know which one that is? Thalidomide. Thalidomide that caused birth defects. Thalidomide that was used to prevent nausea during pregnancy is actually a very, very good anti-neoplastic agent. So when you're assessing safety, one of the ways to assess safety is the balance of what it has to be safe for. Now, if everyone's using it as a hypertensive drug, it has to be safe on a broad spectrum. But if it's being used for a particular niche of people who have a very serious cancer and who may only have 6 months to live, they might tolerate a different level of safety than you or I might in our general days. So phase 2 is safety, then goes to phase 3, which is called this is where the health economics comes in, and is this product really, really going to add anything in the world that's worthwhile us spending money on? And that's what pricing, reimbursement, and market access is all about. Is this worth spending money on? And how do we determine whether it's worth spending money on? Well, what happens then is the companies set up and have a look at health economics and outcomes research, and that's the area. So what happens first is we get the drug, then we have to decide whether we want to test the drug, and countries decide on that on regulation. And the European Regulatory Agency is the European Medicines Agency, and there's the Medicines Research Agency in the UK, but the EMA is the agency that says you can test the drug. And what the EMA says, we think it's safe enough for you to test. Number one, and also you tell us who you want to test it on. Do you want to test it on 5'2" people or 5'7" people? So what the company has to provide at that time as well is what's called a label. It has to say, you have to tell us exactly what you want to use this drug for and the dose. So the company provides what's called a label of what the use of the drug is and the dose, and it goes to regulatory approval. Once it's had regulatory approval, in the EU, countries decide whether they can afford it. And how they decide whether they can afford it is through a health technology assessment, an HTA. And the agency that does health technology assessment within England is NICE. NICE does health technology assessments in England. The Scottish Medicines Agency, SMC, does it in Scotland. Wales has its own agency as well, and in Europe it's done in lots of different ways, and we're going to talk about how every country does it a little bit differently. So the HTA makes an assessment on a reimbursement approval, and then what happens in this country is going to be quite interesting, because now with commissioning, the level of decision about whether a product is going to be incorporated in any region is going to be apportioned down to the commissioners. So the HTA, like NICE, might say, yes, we approve that drug, but, you know, the Imperial Trust might say we can't afford it, so we're not going to get it. Okay? So that's the background, and then at the other end, the company starts trying to market the drug, manufacture it, and sales. Now, if we take a particular drug called Enbrel, which is a drug that's used for rheumatoid arthritis, quite commonly used right now, a big molecule, if you say that Panadol, if you say the Panadol tablet and you compare the molecule in Panadol, the paracetamol molecule, the end-ball molecule, if the paracetamol molecule is the size of a tablet, the end-ball molecule is the size of from here to San Francisco. It crosses the Atlantic 4 times at -4 degrees in its transportation and product making, and so and the purification of it requires albumin, and we know where albumin comes from. Unfortunately, it comes from cows, and the cows can have CJD. So you can see even the manufacturing process at every step of the way can have problems, particularly for these very uncertain and insecure molecules. So though this end of marketing, manufacturing and sales is very, we think very simple, it's also a complex part of the procedure, and is also regulated by agencies like the FDA, Federal Drug Agency. So that's kind of how the process of drugs, pharmaceutical products get made in pharmaceutical companies. Okay. Now, as I said, paying for these varies from country to country, and as I said, the first thing that gets assessed is safety, then efficacy, does it work, and then cost effectiveness. So that's the order of how a drug gets to market. And in the process, in certain countries, this involves more clinician input, more patient input, but in other countries, it really is an economic argument. So there's a broad spectrum. It used to be a clinical one. Myself as a physician could say, I really want that drug, and then I could talk the hospital into getting it in the formulary. But it's not so simple these days. Okay. So as we talked, phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3 trials, phase 1 and phase 2 usually tell you about safety and efficacy, and phase 3 is usually about cost effectiveness, and they're the large randomized controlled trials. And what they usually compare it to, they used to compare it to placebo. Why don't you think they compare it to placebo anymore? Why should an RCT not be involved with a placebo? I mean, that's what you're taught. It should be a placebo, isn't it? The highest level of RCT.
Well, maybe there's competing existing drugs that do similar functions, and you won't actually test whether your new compound is any better than what's on.
Exactly. That's about the compound, but why else? What's wrong with a placebo in oncology? The person's going to die. It's unethical. So in certain areas, it's unethical to test against placebo. So although we say that's the gold standard, if the person's going to die, you want to test against standard of care because there's something out there. So that's why we say it's tested against standard of care. And if there isn't a standard of care that you can test it in, for example, you mightn't have a comparator. They're called, the standard of care is the comparator, where in the country you mightn't have a comparator. Then you have to rely once again on clinicians or on patients to give you some input. And what you do is you can do a treatment practice survey to find out what clinicians do in terms of their practice. And we've got 4 running at the moment, international surveys, 30 clinicians in 12 countries on 4 different areas, looking what the clinicians do with particular patients in different areas of oncology. Okay, this is a complicated slide, but all I wanted to show you was I'm going to run through them just quickly to show you how each country is different. This is what happens in the UK, and particularly through NICE. So you've got licensure, which I said was the regulatory activity. Then once it's got a label, which tells you this drug can be used at this dose for this particular problem, once it's got a label, then the company determines a price, and that's the kind of consultancy that I'm involved with. How does the company work out what the right pricing of this product is? And then it goes to NICE or Wales or Scotland to get assessed to see whether it's in the range of recommendation for reimbursement. And then after that, it goes out, in this country, it'll go out to the consortia to see if they want to buy it. So that's the process in the UK. Starts with a license, goes to a price setting within the company, and then NICE decides if it wants it. And then the consortia decide if they can pay for it. So if we take the next one, this is what happens in France. France has just changed their system. They have what's called a Transparency Commission, which looks at their drugs, which has a similar kind of process. It's got licensure, it's got a health technology assessment, and then the pricing comes after. So they don't set the price, the company doesn't set the price first, it sets the price after negotiation through the health technology assessment. And the reason why France is a little bit interesting, I don't know why I put the wrong on the right click. And don't worry, it's a complicated slide, is for the left-hand side of it's what's really interesting. They do two sets of ratings. They rate the drug on its innovation and on the severity of disease. So they say, is it a major disease? Is it an important disease? Moderate, minor, what's the level of importance of the disease that it's treating? And after that, then they say, so we've got the disease. Is the disease important? Then, is the drug important? So the SMR rates the disease. It's a really important disease. And the ASMR rates the product. How important is the product compared with what's out there already? And that's how France decides on whether the drug is going to be reimbursed in the country. Yeah?
What's the definition of importance then?
Exactly. Exactly. And I'll show you. Let me take you to the next one, and you'll see what the definition of importance is. Less and less is importance. Right? If this is a graph showing an ASMR ratings over the last 3 years in France. They don't define it, they just reduce it. So ASMR 1 is high importance, and ASMR 5 is we don't really think you should get this at any premium price in the market. And as you can see, the number of 1s is pretty small and the number of 5s has increased. And why is that the case? Well, most countries have restricted budgets. So there's cut down. But so the level of importance is in some ways done by committees, even with NICE, behind closed doors. But the way the companies prepare a dossier to introduce the concept of level of importance is by what's called unmet need and burden of illness. So what we would be doing in our company to try to help a pharmaceutical company get reimbursement, we'd say, what is the unmet need, which is what is the epidemiology of the disease? Is ovarian cancer increasing in the world? Is it? No. So the unmet need in terms of the prevalence of ovarian cancer is not changing. However, if we look at unmet need in terms of treatment value in ovarian cancer, the treatments aren't extending life, so there's an unmet need because though the volume of disease isn't changing, and yet it's one of the major cancers of women, so it has an importance, although the volume isn't changing, the treatments aren't extending life. So there is a burden of illness out there. There are people with the illness who aren't getting the treatment that may improve them. So unmet need's the first one. What's the epidemiology? Second, is there a burden of illness? And the third one in that area of importance is what is the eligible patient population? Who should be getting the drug? Okay, so that's how the importance is determined, and we provide help to provide the evidence for that kind of activity about there is a need for this product. So that's in relation to the disease. Then there's a need for this product in relation to the other products on the market. For example, does this product provide any overall advantage to the other products? And I'm going to come to that in a minute with some of the rulings. But this is interesting, is that everyone's shrinking the economy, and France particularly so, is more and more drugs are rated at the level at which they are virtually not going to get reimbursed at a level that the company will be prepared to accept. And when you're thinking about the enormous prices, remember I've just told you that companies can pay up to $3 billion. I don't know what Roche paid for Gentech, but it was a lot of money. So you, at the front end, for these molecules, there's a lot being spent. Okay, so that's France. Okay, wrong way. Okay, Germany's just introduced, and every country does it differently. Germany's just introduced a whole new system called AMNOG, and I won't say it because the German words are about this long, each one of them that's in it. But you can look it up for yourself. But AMNOG, and AMNOG is their new agency that's assessing drugs. Prior to that, it was mainly clinician-based. The clinicians thought it was a good idea, and they reimbursed. But in Germany, AMNOG came along, and what AMNOG does first is it sends out, and this is a bit like what happens in this country, it sends out the dossier that the manufacturer provides about whether the drug is cost-effective to an outside university agency called IQWiG. And in this country, it's done too. There's an EMR, there's an assessment, an agency assessment, and the universities that do that, Southampton, Sheffield, York, and anyone else who wants to go playing. They're the three that are doing it at the moment. So these universities do recheck the assessment that's done by the manufacturer. So if we assist the manufacturer to provide a dossier to the company, the dossier which takes us between 18 months and 2 years to do and is about 300 pages long, every particular article we put in that, because we do a systematic review, is reviewed by the independent agency and evaluated to whether it should be in the dossier and the summary document submission. So we do all the work, and then the agencies don't trust the work that's done and do it again. Which, fair enough, because we do the work and we hand it over to the pharma company and they can do what they like with it. They can use the dossier or not. So there's got to be some kind of regulatory testing. So what happens is IQWiG in Germany reviews the dossier and provides advice to the pricing authority, the GBA, in the AMNOG, and it's, this is this benefit assessment. Where's my mouse? This benefit assessment here, and then the benefit assessment goes along, and there is a decision about whether the drug is going to be acceptable to be put on the market in Germany in pricing. And then the Germans do a very interesting thing. They say, because price is difficult to determine, they say, well, we're going to let you have whatever price you like for the first year, and after the first year we're going to see what the effect of your drug is, and then we're going to review your price. So you can charge what you like for 1 year, but whatever you charge, we'll be reviewing it at the end of 1 year. And the reason they do that, they say until a product is on the market, which is not a bad idea, how can we assess its effectiveness or how its use? Because it takes time for a product to go into the market and be used and trialled out. So they say we'll give you a year, and then you come back, and then we're going to negotiate after a year the pricing. Well, this is a new system, and it's only been operating since April last year. So not even the first drugs under this system have come back for repricing. So in Germany, it's wait and see how this process works. Okay, that's Germany. So we've got the UK doing it through NICE with independent assessment coming back to NICE. We've got France with a Transparency Commission which rates the relative importance of the disease and the drug. We've got Germany that says you provide the dossier, we'll check it, you can do what you like for a year if we like it, and then we'll check your price. So they're all a little bit different. Then we've got Spain. Spain's broke, completely broke. And in fact, some of the poorer regions haven't paid for their drugs in hospitals for the last 3 years. So Spain's broke. But what it has is, once again, a regulatory agency centrally that determines the negotiations. But the point about Spain is it's all done at a regional level, and I'll compare these later. Each region does cost effectiveness for themselves and decides whether they want the drug. And as you probably know from the Mediterranean countries, the northern regions have money and the southern regions don't. So consequently, drugs may be accepted in the region in Catalonia and they're not in the Castilian regions. So you've got situations in countries which will happen here with commissioning. Regions will be able to get drugs and others won't. So that's what happens in Spain. Now, Spain does something very interesting. It says, I'm not sure, I really think, I know what you're telling me is true. So why don't we share the risk? Or if I spend too much money, I want you to pay me back. So there are a whole lot of arrangements that regions and governments make with pharmaceutical industry to risk share. And I'm going to talk about some of them shortly because Italy does it even better. So risk sharing is a way of saying, if you purport that this drug works, that's really good, but we're going to make you share the risk if you're telling us a story. Or if it's too expensive. So let's have a look at Italy's risk sharing because they do it very well. Okay. So Italy, once again, it's a regional activity and the reimbursement is determined on the classification and there's a factory price for it. So once again, licensing, what's the label? Secondly, nationally, is the drug cost effective? Finally, we'll determine at a region whether we're going to actually afford to get it or not. So, so going through it just so get it right. In the UK, as I said, NICE is the main agency. The Scottish Medicines Agency is the other agency. One of the reasons people look at the Scottish Medicines Agency internationally, as they do at NICE, is because SMC publishes its results very quickly. It can give you a result in 3 to 4 months. Some of these other agencies can take up to a year to assess the drug. So you're sitting for a year without the drug even being assessed, let alone get into production, after you've done all the regulatory activities. So SMC is pretty quick. It's moderately rigorous. It gives you a clue. NICE takes a little bit longer. And, of course, the gold standard is one of the reasons why, of course, people like the Australian accent is the granddaddy of them all is the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee in Australia, which first started cost-effectiveness programs and is still leading the way in it. This kind of work started in Australia at the PBAC. So you've got NICE, SMC, and the Wales Medicines Agency. Now, what they do is assess what a life is worth. How much do you think a life's worth per year?
Depends on the sex and age.
Okay. That'd be nice, that's true, and that extends that's the quality of life is adjusted, but just on average, what do you think you're worth to this government to have in this world? What's up there? You're worth £30,000 a year. The government assesses that you're worth £30,000 a year. So to keep you going at they're going to spend £30,000 a year on a product to keep you alive. And that's the cost, that's the level. Okay? So for every quality of life year adjusted they get for you, it's got to be £30,000. If you keep your drug under £30,000, NICE says, it's worth it to my people. If it gets above 30,000, you're in trouble. And if it gets over 50,000, you can forget it. Nobody is worth more than 50,000 in a country that looks at cost effectiveness. Of course, I'm not talking about the United States here. I'll come back and do that another time. That's a minefield. But here, in the EU and most other countries that have some kind of national healthcare scheme working, you're worth about 30,000. Okay? So that's the cost effectiveness in the UK. As I said, France has the Transparency Commission. The Transparency Commission has the components which it says we said, is there an unmet need of disease? Is there an incremental therapeutic benefit, which CEPS determines? And then HAS is the final agency which says, what's the price? Germany, we talked about it. Free pricing for the first year. GBA, IPQUIG, free pricing. Italy and Spain, similarly, it's in the regional activity. And this will be up on your net, so I don't want to waste my time doing it because you can read. It's all very complicated, but I just want you to get the concept so we can have a little talk about it. So if we're looking across the countries in the EU about what the level of influence is in terms of determining whether pharmaceutical products get to market, on a national level, there is a national agency across, this is the EU top 5. Now, if we're thinking about what markets, in terms of markets, what's the biggest pharma market in the world? Where do you want to sell your drugs? States, US, biggest market in the world. What's the size of the Australian market? Just thought I'd throw it in. 1%. Now, I did that because I wanted you to tell me what you think the size of the UK market is. It's a trick question. It's only 3% because it's very tight controls on what comes here. So if we're thinking about EU, the top 5, you need to be thinking about the top 5 if you're thinking about entering the European market, not just UK. Although the population is here and the standard of living is high here, it's not high in the market stakes. So when you're thinking in terms of bringing a product here, you think about the top 5. So it's, you know, UK, Germany, France, Spain and Italy, and quite often a couple of other markets are thrown in because they have good cost effectiveness activities and they are recognised for such. Sweden, quite often thrown in, and the Netherlands because they really have a good regulatory system. So they're quite often put in the mix as well. Canada has a very good assessment system but doesn't buy any drugs, so nobody tries to sell in Canada anymore. You can ruin your market completely. For example, Canada and, for example, New Zealand have ruined their market for new drugs because they couldn't afford them. So no drugs are even priced in these countries. This particular process of health technology assessment can cost a company anything up to 50 to 60 million per country. It's an expensive activity this assessment activity. So it has to decide what the risk-benefit is. Remember, they've spent a fortune already buying the drug if they've bought it, testing the drug, and here we are at 10 years from when they first got the product to 5 years to the final assessment. So we've got a regional assessment across all of them. The regional assessment in France is of very little interest. And one of the reasons is because they're still quite unified in determining their activity. For example, in the area of things like Herceptin, which is called a companion diagnostic, where you've got a test to see if you've got the genetic marker so you can have the drug. France has nominated 20 centres, will be the only testing centres for Herceptin. So they can tightly regulate the market federally, so there's not a lot that happens in France in the regional or local level. Whereas in Germany, there's a bit that happens in the local formulary, but quite strongly in the national level. And as you can see, in Italy, the regional level is very important. And the region that people go by, and I showed in the last one, is UVEA, Veneto region, most richest region in Italy. So any decisions that are made in Italy are really made in the Veneto region, and it's done regionally, not locally. And in Spain, similar regional, as I said, Catalonia, around Barcelona, richest region. So the primary decisions on drugs in Spain are made around that region. And in the UK, as you can see, no regional. It's got rid of your regional activities. Your trust, every revision has removed a regional level. The SHAs have gone, now the PCTs, it's going to be very local consortia based. NICE will determine it, and then the local consortia will say whether they pay for it. Okay. So remember, how do they make the decisions? I've told you what they do and why they do it. Let's have a think about how we get importance. Your question before about importance. How do we determine importance? Well, do they have a trial which compares apples with apples? Is it the right comparator? And one of the problems with comparators is if you set up a trial 4 years ago, you don't know what your competitors might be because new products might be coming into the market all the time. So if you are a competitor against an old drug, for example, in the area of melanoma, there's a big renaissance now because there's a whole new raft of drugs coming out for melanoma. And in the old world, the drugs that were tested were drugs that killed the DNA, poisonous drugs that killed DNA, which is the old treatment for oncology. The newer drugs are much more about immunology and changing protein expression within cells. If you compared yourself to a DNA killer, dacarbazine, that is not the appropriate comparator now. And it would be said that you haven't conducted the right trial to check out reimbursement, because there are newer drugs on the market that you should be compared to. So it's very important for pharmaceutical companies to think about what the active comparator is. And if they haven't got an active comparator, they have to do a whole lot of economic analyses, which are called indirect treatment comparisons, looking through research studies, through systematic reviews, to see if they can see that if A was compared with B and B was compared with C, then I can compare A to C. And those of you who know about data logic, that's a real mismatch in terms of epidemiological, logical data, but it's acceptable in economic data. So is your comparator okay? Second thing is, you say you want this to work on everyone, and before we said about how important age sex is, well, maybe that's no good. Maybe your drug is really toxic to the elderly, and maybe you shouldn't be allowed to prescribe it for those over 70 because they all die from lack of white cells. So I'm not going to let you to prescribe it to them. I'm going to limit it. Or maybe the simpler one is you haven't tested it on kids. I'm not going to let you prescribe it on kids' leukemia because we know it's different. So you tell us about your subpopulation. Biomarkers, the other way, if you're HERS positive, then you should be able to get something. In melanoma, it's BRAF wild type. So there are subpopulations. Have you got the right population? And you can see why countries want to get it down to a subpopulation, because they have to pay for less people. The smaller the subpopulation, the less people they have to pay for. The corollary is also true, is if a pharmaceutical company gets it accepted in a subpopulation, it can add bracket creep to a next subpopulation, and build up a larger population. So it kind of works both ways. So what's the subpopulation? Okay, and as we've talked about, how much is this drug worth in terms of the importance of the drug and the cost effectiveness in terms of what's the life worth? Now, remember how we said safety and then we said efficacy? Well, safety is pretty important. So quality of life becomes important here, although it's really only assessed in the UK and a bit in Australia. But quality of life is important Because if you're not improving the person's quality of life, what does the drug do? It either extends life or improves the quality of life. Now, where it's important to improve the quality of life, is it important to improve the quality of life for older people or younger people more? Come on, be David Cameron. Older or younger people? Yeah, but if you're thinking economically, you want to keep someone in the workforce. So the argument there quite often is, well, what's the benefit? If we can keep people in the workforce, so we're going to look at the health reported outcomes and the patient reported outcomes to see how it keeps people, younger people in the workforce. That's a determinant for that. In quality adjusted life years, that's an extension in overall survival. But the idea in the younger population is, have we got a population that we are actually going to keep in the workforce? And where this becomes important is in diseases like multiple sclerosis. It's a younger population. You want to make sure they can keep on working through their remissions and exacerbations. Okay, the next things we talked a little bit about, as I said, risk sharing, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, and the importance of regional stakeholders in some of these countries. Now, these drugs only have a certain life cycle and a certain patent durability, which is larger in the US than it is in other countries. So there's regular review of this, and there is a post-marketing surveillance in some countries to see what the projections that were determined in the first place about a product correct. Are you actually selling more or less drug than you said you were going to? Because if you're selling more, you promised us you wouldn't, because we based our budget impact process on you telling us the right number. Okay? So that happens pretty well across, but mostly a little bit in the UK and quite a bit in Australia. So these are the kind of data sets that can help make the decision. Therapeutic benefit we've talked about. Cost effectiveness modelling, which we talked about, really only at the moment, fixed at the moment in the UK, very strongly, a bit in Spain and regions. Budget impact modelling. Every country wants to know what the impact of this is going to be on the country's budget. Quality of life, as we said, mixed thing. Qualities have been out there, but actually saying what it does in terms of functional status, in terms of patient-reported outcomes, EQ5D and EORTC, that's just starting to come as being important. And as I said, head-to-head trials against the right comparator. And if you don't have that, go out and see what's happening in the real world and do a treatment pattern survey or something like that. There is a little bit of interest in innovation and in value-based pricing that's coming out in this country. There is a moiety that's going to be included to talk about innovation. But the innovation that they're talking about is not innovation in a clever new drug. The innovation they're talking about is innovation in terms of the pricing and the cost effectiveness. Can you make the product in the right range of price for us? Okay. So let's have a look what happens across the EU. Let's see what happens with some of these newer drugs and how they've been assessed across, and how different sets can be used for different determinants can be used in different situations. Avastin, or bevacizumab, I can never pronounce half of them, is a drug now that's used for a lot of areas. At the moment it's being tested in ovarian cancer, but it was used in metastatic colorectal cancer. That was the first submission. So MCRC is metastatic colorectal cancer, and it provided a 4.7-month median benefit improvement in overall survival over its comparator. So the people who had metastatic colorectal cancer, the median life extension was from 15 months to 20 months. Not recommended by NICE or SMC. Got a very high reimbursement. Remember we said what ASMR was? We said 2 was good, 1 was the best. French really liked it, gave it a 2. And so there you already got a difference. Same drug, same indication. Scotland and England say no. France says, quite nice, thank you very much. We'll have it. Okay, so let's go. Nexavar for renal, RCC is renal cell carcinoma. Sorafenib, it offered a 3. Now that's being used in hepatocellular carcinoma as well. So you can see that. That's the next one. We're going to do it in renal, and then we're going to do it in hepatocellular. Same drug, different indication. Once again, 3-month median improvement, okay, over placebo. PFS is Any ideas what PFS stands for? Progression-free survival. In some of these oncological areas, you can't look at overall survival. What you're looking at is time between treatment and progression. Because the tail of survival is too long to see in the analysis. So progression-free survival. So, and against placebo, so got to 24 weeks, 24 weeks versus 12. I mean, if you talk to people outside that you're just extending someone's life by 3 months or 4 months, and it's going to cost, you know, £40,000 a year. This is the area that we're working in, okay? Once again, NICE SMC said no, and France again said 2. We like this one too. It's enough for us. And also, in Italy, it was reimbursed. But look what the Italians said. You've got to give us a discount of 50% on the first 2 cycles. So cancer drugs are done in cycles, and some of these areas is up to 6 cycles. The cycle usually depends on the drug and the treatment, but the cycle can run somewhere like 3 weeks with a break and then runs again. So what's happening in Italy, they said, you can have the first 2 cycles, you can have it, but you're going to pay half for the first 2 cycles. The company. In these countries, not much. If I go back, you're absolutely right. And that's, oh, sorry, I'll just go the other way. Oh, let's see if I can go back. Have a little look. As you can see, nothing in the quality of life is expected except in the UK. It's nice to have it in the others, but it's only expected anywhere in the UK. The other agencies will look at it, but it won't impact significantly on the decision making. And some of the reasons for that is because some of the indicators are tricky and it's difficult to map them to other ones. So, It does have advice, and it does take quality of life into account. The indicators it takes into account are an indicator called EQ5D and the EORTC30. They're the 2 indicators that they use as PROs. The problem with those is they are very generic instruments, and there's not a lot of mapping. For example, they might map to quality of life for someone with melanoma what the skin disfigurement is, or someone with Kaposi sarcoma and HIV. So one of the problems with some of these PRO instruments is their mapping to the accepted instrument is pretty tricky and not always accurate. Am I getting to where you want me to go? Answering the question? Yeah. So for example, if I am, there's for melanoma, there's a new instrument called FACT-M for melanoma, which looks at skin disfigurement. For ovarian cancer, there's one for ovarian, but the mapping is pretty rudimentary.
This is a big issue, isn't it? Because it's going to be a much more cost-effective on a disease-specific quality of life instrument. So is that issue not being tackled?
Absolutely. And what happens is every company is trying to validate their own PRO instrument. I mean, I'd be surprised if you won't be asked by some company to start validating a PRO instrument. Every company. And the classic example, the one that really worked in the first place, was when the SSRIs came in and Pfizer did PRIME-MD. You know, it's for depression. Originally, there was the GHQ, there's the geriatric depression scale. Well then, you know, Pfizer decided it could set up very nicely, I think it was Pfizer, one of them. Forgive me, Pfizer, I'm going to be sued on YouTube. One of them set up the concept that those instruments didn't work in primary care. We needed an instrument in primary care that differentiated between drug use and CBT. So they developed their own instrument called PRIME-MD. And that started it. And you can see each market now is trying to develop up its own PRO instruments. But as I said, NICE is going to say, map them for me. Because I have to compare a drug for oncology for renal cell carcinoma with one for hepatocellular carcinoma. And I need some kind of mapping activity. More and more it's happening, and then the other way that it can happen is different companies put in different submissions. Some companies are better at getting a submission and a mapping of a PRO or establishing them. For example, Herceptin established some PROs in the area of breast cancer that are now accepted as a fact breast. So there's some different indicators that are accepted. The real problem, do you want me to, one more step about PROs? The real problem with PROs in phase 3 trials is that patients don't usually fill them out. So the data is always not very clean. You know, when you run a trial in a hospital, patients have to fill out the patient-reported outcome, and that's not very heavily followed up by the clinical departments because it's run by medical departments who are really only looking at safety and efficacy. So your data often isn't very good in that area either. Shall I go on? I mean, I could go on. I'll go on and just to the other. Okay, so let's talk. I remember I said a little bit about risk sharing. There's the 3 different kinds of risk sharing that can go on. You know, we said the last, if I take you back to where we were the last one, remember we said that in the bottom, Nexavar, which is sorafenib, in Italy, had a risk sharing arrangement that the company had to bear 50% of the cost of the first 2 cycles. So that's why we're going on to risk sharing now. Okay, so the first one is we don't want to pay for those people who you shouldn't have put on the drug in the first place. We're not paying for non-responders. So if you run Avastin or bevacizumab for 3 cycles and they don't respond, we want you to pay the money back to us. Because why should we be treating people who don't respond? So that's the first very tough level of risk sharing. The second one is the one we saw. This is a risky activity. We want you to share the risk on the real world data for this drug. You pay 50% for the first 2 cycles. And the third one is for the first cycle of the non-responder, not just for all of them, but for just the first cycle. And there's 3 examples of where that's occurred. The risk share arrangements. You know, Avastin, as I said, bevacizumab, 3 cycles, and that was, as we said before, that can be across 3 different areas. Bevacizumab is a very, very interesting new drug. It's a drug that does what's called angiogenesis. There's a belief now that there's a debate, but there's a belief that the vasculature that goes to tumours is inadequate. And so some of the new drugs actually make good vasculature to tumours so other drugs can get in there and kill them. Because the vasculature is erratic. So the tumour grows, but it makes bad vessels to feed itself. So you want to make the railway good so poison can go in. So bevacizumab is one of those drugs. It's an angiogenesis agent. Avastin. Okay. So having a look, remember how we said, and this is back to the point of the utility data, the areas that they look at, certainly SMC and NICE will look at PRO and utility data. Utility data is really gone through actually sitting with patients and interviewing them and asking them, what's your disutility? What is happening to you? And how is this drug actually making your life better? And if you want to trade, quite often it's done with trade-off activity. Would you trade off this for that? Would you trade off a scar for being able to walk 2 feet? A headache in the morning for being able to lie in? It's quite often a trade-off situation. And they're kind of vignettes that are made for them. And we talked about the eligible patient population. Who should it be given to? Survival data we talked about. As I showed you in oncology, survival data is pretty tricky because they all die. And really you're just extending life by a short period. So what you really want to do is really give them, you know, progression-free survival is what you're looking for. How long till their next episode where they're going to need some treatment or something like that. And IQWiG says, what's the population? That's the end of the formal bit. I can extend on any of the bits that people might be interested in. I've focused on oncology because that's one of the major areas we work in. Rheumatology is pretty similar and immunology is pretty similar. The area in terms of pricing what we call the small molecules, which are the cheaper drugs, is really just like a pharmacy. Because there's not a lot of innovation there. They are usually tend to be priced in like what's the generic paracetamol versus Panadol. So that's why I haven't focused on that area because that's not the high cost end of the market. The 2 new things that are probably are interesting are what are called orphan drugs and orphan conditions, because the FDA decided in small areas and in this country as well that if there were very few people, it could bear the risk of a very expensive drug. So if you've got less than a certain number of people in the country with a disease, the thresholds are increased. An example of that is B-cell acute lymphoblastic lymphoma. So orphan drugs. In relation to the new system that's coming up, which is called value-based pricing, The issue in terms of value-based pricing is a little bit more complex, but what that's going to mean is that they are going to set up pricing weights for different diseases. They're going to say this disease has a particular weight, and NICE will set them up, and it's negotiating to set them up. Your drug has to fit within the pricing weight of this particular disease. And that's the basis of the new value-based pricing that's coming in. So I'm happy to stop there. As you can see, I probably could go on for quite a while, but I'll stop there. Any particular questions or anything that wasn't clear? Or I'll clap. Thank you.